The sun rose slowly over the rolling hills of the western frontier, painting the skies with strokes of gold and crimson. As the light spread across the land, it touched upon acres of lush grassland and fences stretching farther than the eye could see. This land belonged to Richard Harlow, a man many in the county called the wealthiest rancher alive. His sprawling estate was a symbol of prosperity, with hundreds of cattle grazing freely and dozens of ranch hands laboring to keep the empire thriving. To outsiders, Richard seemed to have it all: power, wealth, and respect. But behind the glimmer of success lay a man hardened by ambition. Richard had built his reputation on grit and determination, but somewhere along the way his heart had grown colder. He measured everything in terms of profit and prestige, and he often looked at people, even his own family, as assets or liabilities. Living under his roof was his grandfather, Thomas Harlow, a man of 85. Thomas had once been strong, vigorous, and full of wisdom. In fact, much of the land Richard claimed as his own was inherited through Thomas's sweat and sacrifice. Decades earlier, Thomas had fought against harsh winters, droughts, and disputes with neighboring landowners to preserve the family ranch. He had carved out a life where none seemed possible, guided only by resilience and an unshakable belief that family and community were life's true treasures. But time had taken its toll. The once sturdy man now walked with a bent back and a heavy cane. His hands, which once handled ropes and reins with ease, now trembled when he tried to lift even the smallest bucket of water. He no longer contributed much to the daily operations, and Richard saw him less as a patriarch and more as a burden. Richard, in his pride, often overlooked his grandfather's role in their history. Where workers remembered Thomas as the man who taught them cattle branding or negotiated peace with neighboring tribes, Richard only saw a frail figure sitting in the corner of the ranch house. To him, Thomas represented weakness, dependency, and a past Richard thought he had outgrown. Despite this, Thomas bore no ill will toward his grandson. Every morning he rose with the sun, greeting the ranch hands kindly, offering small bits of advice or encouragement. Sometimes he would sit by the corral watching the young men train horses, his eyes sparkling with memories of days long gone. He carried stories of hardship and triumph that no book could capture. Yet, in Richard's eyes, those stories were little more than ramblings of an old man. Around town, people whispered of Richard's change in demeanor. "He's forgotten where he came from," the townsfolk would mutter in hushed tones. "He doesn't see that the old man is the reason he has all this." Still, no one dared confront him. His wealth commanded too much respect, and his arrogance too much fear. Inside the household, the tension was more visible. Servants often noticed how Richard snapped at his grandfather for small mistakes, spilling tea, misplacing tools, or asking the same question twice. The grandfather's room, once warm and lively with visits from family, grew increasingly silent. He would often sit by the window, gazing at the horizon, as if remembering a time when family meant more than cattle and gold. What Richard failed to see was that his grandfather still carried influence, not in money or labor, but in the quiet wisdom that shaped those around him. The ranch hands respected Thomas deeply. They would often pause in their work to listen when he spoke of patience with horses, fairness in trade, or courage in adversity. To them, Thomas was not a burden. He was the soul of the ranch. But Richard's pride blinded him. In his world, productivity and reputation defined a person's worth. He had convinced himself that by carrying the ranch forward, expanding its reach, and cementing his name in the county, he was fulfilling his duty to his family legacy. Yet in reality, he was erasing the very foundation on which that legacy stood. Part 1 of this story sets the stage. A proud, wealthy rancher who cannot see beyond his ambition, and an old grandfather whose quiet dignity still holds more value than the rancher can comprehend. It is a clash of perspectives, one focused on wealth and appearances, the other on wisdom and human connection. Unbeknownst to Richard, this blindness would soon cost him dearly. For while he saw his grandfather as nothing more than an old man dependent on his goodwill, others in the land remembered Thomas differently, and when the time came, they would show Richard just how wrong he was. Life on the Harlow Ranch was never still. Every morning, the clang of metal gates, the lowing of cattle, and the shouted orders of ranch hands filled the air. Men rode out at dawn to drive herds across open fields, and by midday, the heat of the sun made every task twice as hard. Richard Harlow, sharp-eyed and commanding, always made sure the ranch ran like a well-oiled machine. Efficiency, precision, and discipline. These were his unyielding expectations. But amidst this rhythm, his grandfather, Thomas, no longer fit neatly into Richard's world. The old man, once the heartbeat of the ranch, now moved slowly, his steps unsteady and his breath short after even the simplest chores. He still rose early, determined not to appear useless, but the ranch hands could see the struggle in his every movement. One morning, Thomas insisted on helping mend a section of fencing along the north pasture. With trembling hands, he tried to hammer nails into the wood. His strokes were weak, and after a few attempts, he dropped the hammer entirely. A young ranch hand rushed forward to assist, but before he could, Richard's voice cut sharply through the air. "Leave it!" Richard barked, glaring at his grandfather. "He'll only slow you down." The workers fell silent, uneasy. They respected Richard's authority, but the sight of the old man bowing his head, ashamed and defeated, unsettled them deeply. Thomas did not argue. He simply stepped aside, leaning on his cane, his weathered face etched with quiet pain. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, the workers often gathered around Thomas on the porch. He would tell them stories of the days when wild horses roamed free, when the land had to be fought for inch by inch, and when he himself had negotiated with neighboring tribes to secure peace. The younger men listened with wide eyes, fascinated by his tales of courage and sacrifice, but Richard rarely joined them. To him, those stories were a waste of time. "Fairy tales for idle men," he muttered more than once, shaking his head. He couldn't understand why his ranch hands seemed to hang on every word of the old man. To Richard, Thomas's presence was becoming more and more of an embarrassment. When visitors came, wealthy neighbors, cattle buyers, or business partners, Thomas sometimes shuffled into the room, offering a shaky handshake and a gentle smile. His words were kind but meandering, and Richard, fearing mockery, often cut him off or sent him away. One evening, during a dinner with a banker from town, Thomas tried to recall an old proverb about patience and livestock breeding. But before he could finish, Richard slammed his glass on the table. "Enough, grandfather," he snapped, his tone icy. "You're confusing our guest with your rambling." The old man fell silent, pushing his plate away, and left the room without a word. The banker, uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, but Richard paid no mind. To him, appearances mattered more than kindness. What Richard failed to recognize was that his harshness was noticed by his workers, by his guests, even by the townsfolk, when whispers carried from the ranch to the saloon. Some pitied Thomas. Others quietly judged Richard. "He's ashamed of the very man who built his legacy," they whispered. The tension in the house grew thicker with every passing week. Thomas's health declined further. Some mornings, he coughed violently, clutching his chest as if each breath were a battle. Still, he tried to help, polishing saddles, folding blankets, or simply offering a word of encouragement to the men as they left for work. But each effort was met with Richard's cold reminder. "You're in the way. Just rest." Sigh. Grandfather did as he was told, but the light in his eyes dimmed. He no longer told as many stories, no longer lingered outside with the ranch hands. Instead, he sat by the window of his small room, staring across the fields he had once tamed with his bare hands. His silence was heavy, but no one in the household dared to confront Richard about it. In truth, Richard felt trapped. A part of him still remembered his childhood, when his grandfather had taught him to ride his first horse, had pulled him onto his knee to tell tales of resilience. But Richard buried those memories deep, convincing himself that sentiment had no place in the life of a successful rancher. To admit otherwise, he thought, would make him weak. Thus, the rancher's heart hardened further. He began to view his grandfather not as the man who had once held the family together, but as a reminder of age, frailty, and dependence, things Richard despised. The burden grew heavier in Richard's mind each day. And though Thomas never complained, never asked for more than a place to rest and a warm meal, his very existence felt to Richard like a weight holding him back. What Richard could not yet see was that this burden was about to lead him to the greatest lesson of his life, a lesson that would shake the foundations of his pride and force him to confront the meaning of true wealth. The summer heat bore down on the Harlow Ranch with unrelenting force. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred by cattle drives and wagon wheels, and tempers ran hotter than the sun overhead. For Richard Harlow, every day felt like a battle, managing finances, overseeing workers, negotiating deals. He thrived in this constant grind, convinced it was what kept his empire alive. But for Thomas, his grandfather, the days were growing more difficult. His body, weakened by age, no longer kept pace with the ranch's demands. The old man still insisted on rising early, shuffling around with his cane, trying to contribute in any way he could. Sometimes he carried water jugs, sometimes he brushed down horses, and sometimes he simply stood in the fields giving advice. To the ranch hands, Thomas's presence was comforting. He reminded them of the land's history, of loyalty and honor that went beyond the fences and the profits. But to Richard, every time he saw his grandfather struggle, it only deepened his sense of irritation. One evening, the household gathered for supper. The long wooden table groaned with platters of roasted beef, cornbread, and fresh vegetables. Workers who lived on the ranch joined, along with Richard's wife, Clara, and their young son, Samuel. Normally, the meals were cheerful. Samuel asking questions about horses, the workers sharing jokes about the day. But that night, a storm of tension was brewing. Thomas, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, tried to engage in conversation. He spoke of a lesson he'd learned in his youth, when a neighbor nearly lost his herd by driving them too hard in the summer heat. "You mustn't push a creature past its limits," he said softly, his eyes moving to his great-grandson. "Be it a horse, a cow, or even a man, everything has its breaking point." The table grew quiet for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a gentle warning. But Richard's jaw tightened. He felt his authority undermined, as if the old man's parable questioned his way of running the ranch. "That's enough, grandfather," Richard said curtly. Thomas blinked, surprised. "I was only—" "You were only rambling again," Richard cut him off sharply, his voice echoing against the wooden walls. "You think the ranch runs on old sayings, on caution and fairy tales? This ranch runs on strength, efficiency, and progress, not weakness." The room fell silent. Clara lowered her gaze, unwilling to intervene. Samuel stared at his great-grandfather, confusion in his young eyes. The ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty torn between respect for the old man and fear of their employer. Thomas swallowed his words, his shoulders slumping. He lowered his gaze to his untouched plate, the weight of humiliation pressing heavy on his chest. But Richard was not finished. His frustration, bottled up for weeks, finally burst. "You do nothing here," he said bitterly, his voice rising. "You don't work. You don't contribute. You sit around telling stories no one needs, slowing us all down. I've carried this ranch forward, not you, and I won't let your frailty drag us backward." Gasps rippled around the table. Samuel clutched his mother's arm, frightened by the harshness of his father's tone. Clara whispered Richard's name in a plea for restraint, but he ignored her. At last, Richard pushed his chair back and stood, his hands planted firmly on the table. "From tonight on, you are no longer welcome under this roof. You want to live. Like a burden? Fine, but not here. Not in my house. Pack your things and go." The words struck the room like thunder. For a long moment, no one moved. Thomas's eyes, clouded with hurt, lifted to meet his grandson's. He said nothing, no defense, no protest, only silence. Then, slowly, he pushed back his chair and rose to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. Without a word, he walked from the room, his footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of finality. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she dared not speak against her husband in front of the workers. The ranch hands, though furious inside, bowed their heads. None dared challenge Richard's authority. Later that night, Thomas gathered his meager belongings, a worn blanket, a few clothes, and the walking stick that had supported him for years. He paused by the door of his small room, glancing last time at the place where he had lived, where his memories were carved into every wooden beam. With a deep breath, he stepped into the darkness outside. The stars stretched endlessly above, indifferent to human pride and pain. The old man began to walk slowly down the dirt road leading away from the ranch, his cane tapping softly with each step. He did not look back. Inside the house, Samuel peeked from his window, watching the fragile figure disappear into the night. His young heart ached, though he did not yet understand why. Clara wept quietly into her hands, and Richard, though triumphant in his decision, could not entirely silence the faint voice of guilt that whispered in the corners of his mind. But he brushed it aside, telling himself he had done the right thing. He believed he had freed himself of a burden. What he did not know was that, in casting out his grandfather, he had set in motion a series of events that would forever change his understanding of honor, respect, and true wealth. The prairie was unforgiving. By the time Thomas Harlow had been walking for half a day, the strength in his legs had begun to give way. The old man's cane struck the dirt rhythmically, his small bundle of belongings bouncing lightly against his side with every weary step. The sun blazed above him without mercy, beating down on his weathered skin. Sweat rolled down his temples, soaking the collar of his shirt. Each step became heavier than the last. Though he had lived a long life on this land, the years now weighed heavily on him. His back, once proud and straight, was stooped. His breath came ragged and shallow, and the open road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. He thought of the ranch he had just left, his grandson's home, the place that should have been his refuge. Now it was nothing more than a shadow behind him, a reminder that family had turned him out. So this is how it ends for me, Thomas thought grimly. As his cane slipped against a rock, he stumbled, barely managing to catch himself, his knees shaking like reeds in the wind. His vision blurred, the horizon shimmering. The warmth of the sun no longer felt like life-giving light, but like fire pressing him into the earth. He whispered, a prayer under his breath, uncertain whether he sought strength to continue or peace to surrender. Finally, his legs buckled. With a groan, Thomas fell to his knees, the bundle rolling from his hand. Dust rose around him as he sank to the ground, his cane clattering beside him. He tried to push himself up, but his arms refused. Exhaustion overcame him, and he lay there, his face pressed against the dry dirt. His chest heaved in shallow gasps. For the first time in many years, the unshakable man felt truly alone. But fate had other plans. From a distance, The rhythmic pounding of hooves echoed across the prairie. A young native rider was traveling the trail, guiding his horse steadily across the open land. His keen eyes spotted the figure crumpled by the roadside. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, dust flying up in his wake. When the horse skidded to a stop, the rider swung down with swift, practiced grace. He was a young man, no older than 30, his dark hair tied back, his expression sharp with concern. Kneeling beside the old man, he called out in a language Thomas barely understood, but the tone was clear, gentle, urgent, alive with compassion. "Easy, elder," the rider said in broken English as he placed a steadying hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You are not alone." Thomas blinked, his vision clearing just enough to make out the stranger's face. A mixture of pride and humility shone in the young man's eyes. Though the old man's body was weak, his heart stirred at the kindness extended toward him. The rider pulled a water skin from his saddle and lifted Thomas's head carefully, pressing the cool leather pouch to his lips. Water spilled across the old man's parched mouth, and he drank desperately, each swallow reviving him a little. "There now," the rider murmured softly, supporting him as though he were a treasured relative. "The earth is harsh, but we walk it together." Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown him such tenderness. His own kin had cast him away, yet here was a stranger, a man from a people his grandson had dismissed and mistrusted, offering him compassion without hesitation. With great effort, Thomas whispered, "Thank you, son." His voice was raspy, but sincere. The rider nodded, then helped him to his feet, steadying him when his legs shook. "You come with me," he said firmly, pointing toward the horizon. "My people, they will care for you. You are elder. Elders must be honored." Thomas's chest tightened at those words. Elders must be honored. He thought of his grandson's cold dismissal, of the bitter rejection that had forced him into the dust. Yet here, from a stranger's lips, came a truth he had nearly forgotten. The rider guided him to the horse and, with surprising gentleness, lifted him into the saddle as though he were precious cargo. Mounting behind him, the rider clicked his tongue, and the horse surged forward across the prairie. As the wind rushed past his face, Thomas clutched the saddle horn tightly, his heart swelling with emotions he could barely name: gratitude, relief, and a fragile hope. For the first time since leaving the ranch, he felt he was not abandoned. He was being carried towards something unknown, yes, but something that might just save him. The night had been long and weary for Thomas Harlow. His frail body ached from walking, and the dirt road beneath his worn boots seemed endless. He leaned heavily on his cane, pausing often to catch his breath. The memory of Richard's sharp words echoed in his mind, each step away from the ranch, pulling him deeper into loneliness. By dawn, Thomas reached the edge of a valley, a place that held whispers of the past. Years ago, this land had been home to native families who lived in harmony with the earth, far from the bustle of towns and ranches. Thomas had known them well in his younger days. When he was still strong, he had traded cattle with them, shared harvests during lean years, and defended their rights when others sought to drive them away. To him, they had been friends, not strangers. But so many years had passed that he wondered if they even remembered him. Exhausted, Thomas stumbled to a shaded grove near the valley. He sat against a tree, his chest heaving, his body trembling from fatigue. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer for strength, unsure of where his journey would take him. It wasn't long before voices approached, soft, rhythmic, and unfamiliar at first. Thomas opened his eyes to see a group of natives moving along a trail with baskets of fruit and firewood. They stopped suddenly when they noticed the frail old man leaning against the tree. One of them, a tall man with braided hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward cautiously. But then his gaze softened. He recognized the face before him. "Elder Harlow," the man said, his voice carrying both surprise and reverence. Thomas blinked in confusion. You know me?" The man smiled, nodding. "Of course. You are the one who stood for us when others would not. My father told me stories of your kindness, of the winter when you shared your cattle with our people. We have not forgotten." Before Thomas could respond, the others rushed forward, their faces lighting with recognition. Some of the older women clasped his hands, speaking his name with respect. Children peered curiously from behind their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes full of wonder. The old man's heart swelled with emotion. He had expected indifference, perhaps pity. Instead, he was greeted with warmth, as if he had returned to a long-lost family. They helped him to his feet gently, supporting his frail frame as they guided him toward their village, nestled deeper in the valley. The scent of wood smoke and roasting. Corn drifted in the air as they approached. Huts of woven reeds and wooden beams stood in a circle, and the sound of drums carried faintly in the distance. As they entered, more people gathered, whispering and pointing as they realized who had come among them. One elder woman with hair silver as moonlight stepped forward with tears in her eyes. She had been a young girl when Thomas defended her family's land from encroaching settlers. She remembered how he stood before angry men with rifles and refused to let violence take root. "Brother Harlow," she said softly, taking his hands in hers. "Our children and grandchildren know your name. You are no stranger here. You are part of us." Thomas's eyes blurred with tears. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen, not as a burden, not as a frail old man, but as someone whose life had mattered. The villagers offered him food, bread made from maize, roasted vegetables, and fresh water. They gave him a place to rest in one of the huts, laying soft blankets around him. Everywhere he turned, he was treated with dignity, honor, and gratitude. That evening, the tribe gathered in the village square. The tall man with braided hair stood before the people and spoke loudly. "Years ago, when we were weak, when others tried to take what little we had, Elder Harlow defended us. He gave us cattle when hunger threatened to break us. He showed us respect when others called us savages, and though time has passed, today he has returned to us. We will show him the same honor he once gave us." The crowd erupted in cheers, voices rising in harmony. Children danced around him. Women sang traditional songs, and men pounded drums that echoed across the valley. Thomas sat among them, overwhelmed by the love pouring toward him. His heart, long heavy with sorrow, now felt light. For years, his grandson had dismissed him as useless, but here, among people who remembered his deeds, he was not a burden. He was an honored elder, a man whose legacy lived on not through wealth or cattle, but through kindness and courage. As the firelight flickered across his lined face, Thomas whispered to himself, "I was not forgotten." And in that moment, he realized that sometimes true family is not bound by blood, but by respect, loyalty, and love. The valley pulsed with life as word spread that Elder Harlow, the old rancher who had once stood by the natives in their darkest hours, had returned. What began as whispers among families quickly grew into a movement of remembrance. The people did not see Thomas as a frail man cast aside by his kin. They saw him as a symbol of honor, courage, and generosity, a living story their elders had passed down for years. That evening, Thomas sat by the fire in the center of the village. The flames danced high, sending sparks into the night sky. Around him, men, women, and children gathered, their eyes fixed on the old man who had suddenly become the heart of their celebration. The village elder, the same silver-haired woman, who had first welcomed him, rose slowly and lifted her hand to quiet the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her voice clear despite her age. This man is not just a guest. He is our elder. When hunger and despair nearly consumed us, he gave us food. When enemies came to our borders, he spoke for peace. He is the reason many of us live to see this day. His name has always lived in our stories. Now it lives again among us. The crowd murmured in agreement. Some nodded solemnly, others wiped tears from their eyes. The children, who had heard his name only as part of bedtime tales, now stared at him in awe. Thomas, overwhelmed, tried to protest. "I only did what was right," he whispered, shaking his head. "I am no hero. I am just an old man who tried to do good when I could." But the elder woman shook her head firmly. "No, humility does not erase honor. You are one of us, and we will show you what you mean to us." At once, the people began preparing a ceremony. The men gathered. Drums and rattles, instruments passed down through generations. The women wove garlands of wildflowers, their colors vibrant in the firelight. Children carried bowls of fruit and baskets of grain, symbols of abundance, while young warriors painted their faces in traditional patterns. As Thomas watched them work together, his heart ached with gratitude. He had been cast out of his own home, stripped of dignity by the very family he had once nurtured. Yet here, among people who owed him nothing, he was embraced as family, as elder, as guide. When the preparations were finished, the ceremony began. The air filled with the rhythmic beat of drums, deep and steady like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Voices rose in song, chants of thanks and honor echoing across the valley. Dancers circled the fire, their movements fluid, powerful, and reverent. Then slowly they turned their circle inward, surrounding Thomas. He sat in the center, the flickering fire casting shadows on his weathered face. The villagers chanted his name, not in English but in their own tongue, giving him a title that meant Protector of the Valley. Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. He had never sought recognition, never expected gratitude. In fact, he had long believed his deeds had been forgotten, buried by time. Yet here he was, surrounded by nearly 200 souls, all giving thanks for the choices he had made so long ago. A young girl, no older than 8, approached shyly with a garland of flowers. She placed it gently around his neck and whispered, "Thank you, Elder. Because of you, I am alive." Thomas's heart broke and healed in the same moment. He reached out a trembling hand to rest on her shoulder, his voice shaking. "No, little one. Thank your people. They endured. They kept the fire alive." But the crowd shouted back, "And you kept us alive!" The ceremony lasted deep into the night. There was laughter, song, feasting, and storytelling. Men and women recounted how Thomas had once stood against greedy land barons, how he had shared his cattle during a drought, how he had taught them to mend fences and care for livestock in ways that strengthened both their people and the land. Each story was met with cheers, each memory a thread weaving him tighter into the fabric of their community. For Thomas, the night was more than celebration. It was redemption. After years of being dismissed as a burden, he was reminded that his life had mattered. His sacrifices, unseen by his grandson, had left ripples that touched generations. As the fire burned low and the stars glittered above, Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He could hear the laughter of children, the steady drums, the soft prayers of the elders. His body still ached, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years, and in that sacred circle of honor, Thomas found what he thought he had lost forever, a sense of belonging. The morning sun rose gently over the valley, spilling golden light across the native village. The day had been chosen carefully, a day of significance, one marked in their traditions as a time for giving thanks to elders. But now it would carry a new meaning. For today they would honor Thomas Harlow, the man they had long remembered in story, but now embraced in life. By midday, the preparations were complete. Families poured into the village from nearby settlements, traveling. By foot and horseback, each eager to be part of something extraordinary. Nearly 200 people gathered, their presence filling the air with excitement and reverence. Children clutched small offerings of flowers, while elders carried sacred objects that symbolized endurance, wisdom, and protection. Thomas, though still frail, had been given a place of honor beneath a canopy woven from reeds and branches. Blankets were laid beneath him so that he could sit comfortably. The fire burned brightly before him, its smoke curling into the sky as if carrying prayers to the heavens. The ceremony began with silence, a deep, respectful quiet that seemed to draw the very air into stillness. Then, slowly, the drums started. Deep, steady, like a heartbeat, the rhythm spread through the crowd, uniting them in a single pulse. Voices followed, rising in a chant that blended power with tenderness. One by one, villagers stepped forward to lay gifts at Thomas's feet. A young hunter placed a bow, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of protection. A mother set down a bowl of corn, representing nourishment. A child brought a simple handmade doll, whispering, "So you will never be lonely." Thomas's hands trembled as he touched each offering. Tears blurred his vision, and he whispered, "I am unworthy of this." But the elder woman with silver hair stepped forward, lifting her hands. "You are worthy because you gave when you had no reason to. You honored us when others scorned us. You are not only our friend, Thomas Harlow, you are our elder." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices echoing through the valley. Next came the dances. Warriors painted in red and black moved in strong, sweeping motions, their steps telling the story of Thomas's courage, how he had once stood between the natives and armed men who sought to drive them from their land. With each strike of the drum, the story came alive, not just in words, but in movement. The women followed with a dance of gratitude, their garments swirling in hues of earth and sky. They carried baskets of grain and fruit, scattering handfuls onto the ground as a symbol of abundance, their movements flowing like water. The children joined last, circling Thomas in laughter and joy, their small voices singing a chant that named him Protector of the Valley. Thomas pressed his hand to his chest, overwhelmed. He had never seen such love, not even from his own family. Each gesture told him what his grandson could not, that his life had value, that his deeds had left a legacy beyond wealth or cattle. Then came the final act of honor. Two young men carried forth a cloak woven of animal skins and adorned with feathers. They draped it gently over Thomas's shoulders. It was heavy but warm, and it symbolized leadership and protection. "This cloak," the elder woman declared, "is worn only by those who give without taking, who protect without seeking power. From this day forward, you are not just a guest among us. You are a chief in spirit, a guardian whose name will be spoken with reverence." The crowd erupted in cheers. Drums pounded louder, voices lifted higher, and the fire blazed as if in celebration. Thomas could no longer hold back his emotions. His frail body shook as tears rolled freely down his cheeks. He looked around him, at the faces glowing with respect, at the children smiling with innocence, at the people who saw him not as a burden but as a blessing, and whispered hoarsely, "I thought I had been forgotten, but I see now. I have been remembered in the most beautiful way." The chants grew louder, filling the valley with a sound that seemed to reach the heavens themselves. The old man, once cast out as useless, was now embraced as a living legend. For Thomas, the grand ceremony was not just a celebration, it was redemption. He had been stripped of dignity by his own blood, yet crowned with honor by those once called outsiders. And as the firelight flickered across his face, he realized a profound truth. Wealth could be measured in cattle and gold, but true richness was found in the lives one touched and the love one left behind. That night, as the ceremony wound down and the stars filled the sky, Thomas lay beneath his new cloak. His body was frail, his breath uneven, but his heart was stronger than ever. Surrounded by 200 voices that sang his name, he felt more alive than he had in years, and for the first time in a long while, he slept not with sorrow, but with peace. Back at the Harlow Ranch, life went on with its usual rhythm: cattle to tend, fences to mend, deals to strike. Richard moved through his days with the same rigid determination, but beneath his hard exterior something gnawed at him. Though he had forced his grandfather out, the silence left behind was louder than the old man's presence ever had been. The chair Thomas once used at supper now sat empty, a quiet reminder that no one dared move. Samuel, Richard's young son, often asked where his great-grandfather had gone, his small voice filled with worry. Clara avoided the question, unwilling to tell the boy the truth. Richard told himself he had done the right thing. The old man was a burden, he repeated silently whenever doubt crept in. This ranch needs strength, not weakness. I had no choice. But the words rang hollow, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The ranch hands, too, carried an unspoken resentment. They worked as ordered, but their glances were colder, their silences heavier. Many of them had admired. Thomas now felt the sting of his absence. Richard, who prided himself on commanding respect, could feel their loyalty slipping. One afternoon, as Richard oversaw the branding of new calves, a rider approached from the valley. Dust trailed behind his horse, and when he arrived, he dismounted. Quickly, his face flushed with urgency. "Mr. Harlow," the rider said, tipping his hat nervously. "I've come from the native village down south. I thought you ought to know. Your grandfather is there." Richard froze, the branding iron in his hand growing suddenly heavy. "There?" he asked sharply. "With them? What business does he have there?" The rider hesitated. "It ain't what you think, sir. He's not just there. He's being honored." The whole villages turned out for him. Near 200 souls gathered. They call him Protector of the Valley. A murmur spread among the ranch hands who had overheard. Some smiled faintly, others exchanged knowing looks. The words hit Richard like a blow to the chest. His grandfather, the man he had cast out as useless, was being celebrated by hundreds. The rider continued, lowering his voice. "They say he saved their people years ago, shared cattle in a famine, stood up for their land when no one else would. They remember, and they're thanking him now. Biggest ceremony I've ever seen." Richard's jaw tightened. He dismissed. The rider curtly, but inside, turmoil churned. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he sat alone on the porch of his grand house. The ranch stretched before him, wide, rich, full of cattle. Everything he had built, everything he prided himself on, lay within his sight, yet for the first time it felt empty. His mind replayed the rider's words. Protector of the Valley, honored by 200 souls. Richard poured himself a drink, but the whiskey burned bitter in his throat. He remembered his grandfather's stories, the ones he had always dismissed as ramblings. Could it be true? Had the old man really done such things? And if so, how could Richard, with all his wealth, command less love, less loyalty than a frail elder with nothing but a cane? At supper that night, Samuel spoke again. "Papa," he said quietly, "is it true great-grandfather is with the Valley people? My friend Jacob said they had a feast for him." Clara looked at Richard anxiously, urging him with her eyes to handle the question gently. But Richard had no gentle words left in him. He slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. "Enough talk about him," he barked. "He made his choice. And so did I." Samuel shrank back, frightened. but Clara laid a hand protectively on his shoulder. She didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes. For the first time, Richard felt the isolation closing in, not just from his workers, not just from the town, but from his own family. Later that night, long after the ranch had gone quiet, Richard paced his study restlessly. He stared at the ledgers and contracts stacked on his desk, symbols of his success, but they felt meaningless compared to the image that haunted him. His grandfather, frail and bent, yet surrounded by hundreds who honored him as a chief, a guardian, a man of worth. Jealousy stung his pride, guilt gnawed at his conscience, and, though he tried to smother both beneath a mask of arrogance, one truth kept rising to the surface. He had cast out a man the world still remembered with reverence. Richard Harlow had never been a man who second-guessed his choices. In business, he acted decisively. In ranching, he made hard calls without hesitation. But ever since the rider had told him of his grandfather's honor, a storm had been building inside him. For 3 nights, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed restlessly, haunted by images of Thomas surrounded by hundreds, treated like a chief, while Richard himself, owner of thousands of acres and more cattle than any man in the county, was whispered about with contempt in his own home. Finally, one dawn, as the mist rolled low over the prairie, Richard saddled his best horse. Clara stirred when she heard the creak of leather and the crunch of boots on the porch. "Richard," she called softly, stepping outside in her nightgown. "Where are you going?" He tightened the cinch without meeting her eyes. "To the valley," he muttered. Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. "If you're going to drag him back out of pride, don't. He deserves peace." Her words stung, but Richard only mounted and spurred his horse forward, leaving her gaze behind. The ride to the valley was long and quiet, giving him too much time to think. Every mile reminded him of his grandfather's steady hands that once guided his own on the reins, the patient voice that had taught him to read the land, the quiet strength that had shaped him into the man he was. And yet, when Thomas had grown weak, Richard had thrown him away. By midday, the valley came into view, lush, green, alive with song. Smoke from campfires curled into the sky, and the faint rhythm of drums reached his ears. The closer he rode, the clearer the sound became, singing, laughter, a pulse of celebration that carried across the land. He slowed his horse at the edge of the native settlement. What he saw made him draw a sharp breath. Hundreds of men, women, and children were gathered in a wide circle. Their garments, adorned with beads and feathers, shimmered in the sunlight. In the very center, sitting on a carved wooden seat draped with colorful blankets, was Thomas. The old man looked fragile still, but not broken. His eyes glowed with pride and warmth, and his back, usually bent, seemed straighter under the weight of respect. Children ran up to him with offerings of fruit and flowers. Elders bowed their heads as they spoke to him. Warriors beat their drums in his honor, and women sang songs that carried his name. It was a scene Richard had never imagined, his grandfather not as a burden, but as a beacon. Richard dismounted and stood silently at the edge of the gathering, unsure whether to approach. Some of the natives noticed him, their gazes sharp, but no one stopped the ceremony. He felt small, invisible, like an intruder in a place where his wealth and power meant nothing. A young boy tugged at an elder's sleeve and pointed. The elder turned, recognized Richard, and then whispered something. Word traveled quickly. Soon, Thomas himself lifted his eyes and saw his grandson at the edge of the crowd. For a long moment, their eyes locked. Richard expected anger, maybe hurt. But what he saw instead was calm. His grandfather did not wave, did not call out, but he did not turn away either. The ceremony continued. The chief of the tribe stood and raised his voice. "Today, we honor Thomas Harlow. protector, teacher, friend of our people. When famine struck, he shared his cattle. When greedy men came to take our land, he stood beside us. He is not only a man of years, but a man of honor. May his name be remembered in our songs. The crowd erupted with cheers and chants. The drums thundered louder, and Thomas was crowned with a simple wreath of woven leaves and flowers. Tears glistened in his old eyes as he accepted the honor with humility. Richard's chest tightened painfully. Here he was, a man with barns full of cattle and vaults full of money, yet no one would ever chant his name with such love. His grandfather, whom he had cast aside, had achieved something he never could: true wealth, measured not in land or gold, but in gratitude, respect, and love. Unable to bear the weight of it, Richard stepped forward. The crowd hushed, their eyes following him warily. He stopped just a few paces from his grandfather. His voice trembled, uncharacteristically soft. "Grandfather, I was wrong." The words hung in the air. He had never spoken them to anyone in his life. His throat burned as he continued. "I thought strength was in money, in cattle, in land. But I see now, it's here, in the lives you touched, in the people who love you. I cast you out when I should have cherished you. Forgive me." For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, with effort, he rose to his feet, leaning on his cane. He looked frail, yet in that moment he carried more authority than Richard ever had. "My boy," he said gently, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "True wealth is not in what you keep, but in what you give. You still have time to learn that." Richard bowed, his head, tears stinging his eyes. The crowd remained quiet, watching, waiting. For once, the rancher, the powerful, wealthy man who commanded hundreds, felt like nothing more than a child seeking forgiveness. That night, as the ceremony stretched on with songs and firelight, Richard stayed at the edge, humbled. He had not yet earned redemption, but he had glimpsed the truth, that his grandfather's legacy was not cattle or land, but honor. And for the first time, Richard wondered what legacy he himself would leave behind. The fire crackled high into the night sky, casting golden sparks into the dark as the celebration of Thomas Harlow's life and honor carried on. The valley was alive with song, with drums that beat like a heartbeat, with voices rising to praise a man who had given all he had without ever counting the cost. Richard sat apart, on the edge of the gathering, his hat pulled low. All his life, he had been the center of attention, the man others looked toward for decisions, for power, for guidance. But here, he was just a shadow. No one praised him, no songs bore his name. And for the first time, he understood why. The sight of his grandfather glowing in the firelight, old, frail, yet standing taller in spirit than any rancher or businessman Richard had ever known, cut deep into his heart. He had spent years building fences and expanding pastures, but in the process, he had built walls around his soul. As the night grew quiet, the people drifted away to their tents, leaving the fire to burn low. Only Richard and Thomas remained, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. Finally, Richard stood, walked to his grandfather, and sat down beside him on the log. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of embers and the distant rustle of the prairie wind. At last, Richard broke the silence, his voice thick with the weight of a man unaccustomed to confession. "Grandfather," he whispered, "I came here hoping to make things right, but I don't know if I can. I sent you away, treated you like a burden, when all my life you carried me." Thomas turned his head slowly, his weathered face illuminated by the flicker of firelight. His eyes were soft, not condemning. "Do you regret it, truly?" he asked. Richard swallowed hard. Every moment since the rider told me of this gathering, I thought my wealth made me powerful, but I see now it only made me blind. These people, he gestured toward the valley. They honor you because you gave. I've only ever taken. Tell me, grandfather, is it too late for me to change? Thomas was silent for a long while. His cane rested across his lap, his gnarled hands folded over it. At last, he spoke, his voice slow but steady. My boy, regret is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. You can change, but only if you live differently. Wealth, land, cattle, they'll pass on to someone else when you're gone. But honor, kindness, sacrifice, those are the only riches you carry beyond the grave. Those are the songs people sing. Richard's chest tightened. His eyes stung, but he fought the tears back. Then teach me, grandfather. Show me how to live the way you did. Thomas gave a faint smile, tired yet proud. No one can teach you that, Richard. You must choose it. Every day, in every deed. The fire died lower, leaving the valley wrapped in cool silence. Richard felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. But for the first time, it wasn't crushing. It was guiding. Thomas leaned back, gazing at the stars. My time is short, he murmured, but tonight, I am full. These people have given me more honor than I ever dreamed of. And you, my boy, you've come back. That is enough. Richard's throat closed. He reached out and took his grandfather's hand, rough, weathered, but still warm. For years he had been too proud to offer such a simple gesture. Now it felt like the only thing that mattered. They sat that way for hours, saying little, watching the fire fade to embers. By dawn, the valley stirred again. The natives began to prepare breakfast, children laughing as they ran to fetch water. Richard woke from a light doze, still seated beside Thomas. But when he turned to speak, he found the old man's eyes closed, his chest still, his hand limp in his own. For a long time, Richard did not move. He simply sat in silence, holding the hand of the man who had been his guide, his foundation, his truest teacher. Tears ran down his face, hot and unashamed. Word spread quickly through the camp. The people gathered again, not with wailing, but with solemn song. They lifted Thomas's body gently, carried him to a high place on the hill, and laid him to rest, with honor. Their voices rose in chants that echoed across the valley, a farewell fit for a king.